I would like to present you the work called the experimental investigation of physical and mechanical properties of processes accompanied with phase transition in water-saturated soil. This work is devoted to experimental and numerical investigation of mechanical behavior of water-saturated soil in freezing and thawing processes. The report is divided into several parts. In the first, I will talk about the goals set in the work and the methods for achieving those goals. Next, I will talk about the experimental parts of the work, then about the numerical model. In conclusion, we consider the results of the study and summarize the work. The aim of the present work is to develop an experimental method for studying the kinetics of phase transition in a water-saturated porous media and the accompanying the physical and mechanical processes. In the framework of the task, the following approaches are applied: determination of physical parameter of soil by the methods of solving the inverse problem based on experimental data, development of the numerical model of freezing a sample of water-saturated soil, and an experimental study using fiber optic sensor based on Bragg ratings. The study of the deformation arising during the crystallization of moisture in a fluid-saturated medium was carried out on the basis of the following experiment. The plastic foam was filled with sandy soil. Fiber optic sensor based on two types of Bragg ratings, temperature and deformation, were distributed in the sample volume. According to the diagram shown on the figure 4, 5 temperature and 6 deformation sensor and 3 K-type thermocouples. A fiber optic sensor based on the Bragg ratings is a system with a periodically changing reflective index created inside the optical fiber. A lattice with a fixed period has the maximum in the reflected spectrum. A change in the period of lattice caused by deformation or temperature action leads to a shift in the maximum of the reflected spectrum. The density of the rocks was determined by hydrostatic weighting, and the heat capacity and thermal conductivity were determined on the basis of solving the inverse problem of determining the effective value of the coefficient of thermal diffusivity. The problem was solved in axis-symmetric formulation. The boundary conditions on the surface were set from experiment by thermocouples 1 and 2, and the solution of the heat conduction problem itself was carried out on basis of third thermocouple. When determining the thermal diffusivity coefficient, the experimental data were considered from time instance when the phase transition process was absent in the sample. For thawed work, the coefficient was identified by the freezing curve at the time interval in which the temperature is the sample boundaries were above 3 degrees Celsius, and for frozen rock by the defrosting curve at an interval which temperatures were below 6 degrees Celsius. According to the rule of the mixture, the values of thermal diffusivity and the dry skeleton were determined after which knowing the density. The values of thermal conductivity and thermal capacity were calculated. The results of the tests allows us to qualitatively assess the evolution of the phase transition in the process of freezing. The temperature decreasing firstly fills the sensor closest to the surface. Next, the pair of sensors located closest to the center and the last sensor located on the center of the sample. Thermocouples record the similar behavior. The deformation break gating sensors detect an increase of radial deformation with the onset of ice in the sample volume. It's important to say that the sensors located on the periphery shows less strain than the sensor located in the center of the sample. The lines located on the first level and on the second level shows similar results. It should be noted that to isolate the temperature sensor from the deformation effect caused by halving of the medium, the sensors were placed in the thin ceramic tube. To describe phase transition in a fluid-saturated medium and the deformations resulting from the crystallization of moisture in the material, we consider the associated mathematical model of the phase transition with non-equilibrium moisture, describing in detail in the work which noted on bottom of the slide. The initial and boundary conditions and the values of the effective thermophysical parameters of mixture were set from the experiment described above. Unlike the classic Stefan problem, this model takes into account the presence of residual moisture and the rate of crystallization of water. It can be seen that the selected model describes the temperature dependence during the phase transition better than Stefan model. We apply the equation describing the mechanical behavior on the soil during the phase transition to the model, and the result obtained by numerical simulation qualitatively describe the result obtained in the experiment. The solution of this problem shows, as in the experiment, the deformation in the middle of the volume is greater than the periphery. Another interesting observation. We conducted the experiment on unilateral freezing of similar sample. On one side of the sample was laid again the cooling plate, and all other boundaries were thermally insulated. As a result, we obtained a slowly moving phase transition along the axis of this sample. Thermocouples located on the volume made it possible to trace the kinetic and the propagation of the phase transition in volume and estimate the rate of freezing of the rock. After freezing, the sample was divided into 8 parts. In each individual part, the content of the ice was estimated by weighting before and after drying. As a result, we have heterogeneously distributed ice. Here, large values correspond to the edge from which freezing began. Thus, it turns out that moisture in the freezing volume flows onto a phase transition. The main result of the work are presented on the slide. Thank you for your attention.